The distress signal came at 3 in the morning, ship time. Commander Lisa Hernandez was already awake, staring at old mission reports on her screen when the alarm started blinking red. She pressed the button and listened to the message. It was broken, full of static, but she understood enough. The Kethra homeworld was asking for help. Lisa had never met a Kethra in person, but everyone in the fleet knew about them. They were predators. Real predators. 6 legs, scales as black as space, teeth that could cut through metal. They stood 8 feet tall, and they were afraid of nothing. The galaxy respected them. The galaxy feared them. And now they were asking humans for help. She called her senior officers to the bridge. Dr. Nathan Cole arrived first, his hair messy and his eyes tired. He was the ship's xenobiologist, the person who studied alien life. He had spent 20 years learning about strange creatures on strange worlds, but he had never studied the Kethra up close. Nobody had. They did not allow outsiders near their young or their homes. Lieutenant Amy Tran came next, already dressed in her uniform. She was the navigator, and she was already calculating the fastest route to the Kethra system. It would take them 6 days at maximum speed. Chief Engineer Danny Ortiz was the last to arrive. He was a big man with thick arms and a face that always looked angry, even when he was happy. He did not say much, but when he spoke, people listened. He looked at the distress signal data and shook his head slowly. The message said a plague had hit the Kethra colony. Many adults were dead. Many more were dying. And the cubs, the young ones, they had no one to care for them. Lisa made the decision quickly. They would go. They would help. It was what humans did. 6 days later, the Starward Dawn entered orbit around the Kethra world. It was a dark planet, covered in thick forests and deep valleys. The cities were built into the sides of mountains, hidden from view unless you knew where to look. Lisa could see smoke rising from several locations. The plague had hit hard. They received permission to land near the main colony. When the doors of the ship opened, Lisa stepped out first. The air was thick and warm, and it smelled like something old and wild. Standing before her was the tallest Kethra she had ever seen. The matriarch Vorshan was ancient. Her scales had faded from pure black to a dark gray, and her eyes were the color of dying stars. But she stood straight. And her voice was strong when she spoke. She thanked the humans for coming. She explained what had happened. The plague came from nowhere. It killed fast. The healers could not stop it. Now there were hundreds of cubs with no parents, no family, no one to teach them the Kethra way. Lisa offered everything she had: medicine, food, doctors, engineers to fix their broken systems. Vorshan accepted it all, but she made one thing very clear. The cubs were to stay in the dens. The humans could bring supplies, could monitor from a distance, but they were not to touch the young ones. Physical contact with outsiders was forbidden. Lisa wanted to ask why, but she saw something in the old matriarch's eyes, something like shame, something like pain. She decided not to push. Dr. Nathan Cole was assigned to monitor the cubs' health. He set up scanners around the dens, machines that could read vital signs from 50 feet away. He spent hours looking at the data, and what he saw made him worried. The cubs were not doing well. Their heart rates were too fast. Their stress hormones were too high. They were not eating properly, not sleeping properly. Something was wrong, something beyond the plague. He shared his concerns with the matriarch. She listened and said nothing. She told him the cubs would learn to be strong or they would die. That was the Kethra way. The weak did not survive. Nathan did not argue, but he did not agree either. He went back to his data and kept watching. 3 days later, Ensign Grace Liu made a mistake that would change everything. Grace was young, only 22, and this was her first deep space mission. She worked in the medical bay, organizing supplies and running basic tests. She was not important, not special, just a technician doing her job. She was carrying a box of nutrient packs to one of the storage areas near the dens when she took a wrong turn. The corridors all looked the same, dark stone walls with strange markings she could not read. She pushed through a door and found herself inside a quarantine den. The smell hit her first. It was sour, like sickness and fear mixed together. The light was dim, but she could see shapes moving in the corners. Small shapes, cubs. Most of them were huddled together in the center of the room, a pile of black scales and glowing eyes. But in the far corner, pressed against the wall, were 3 small ones. They were separate from the others, pushed away, rejected. Grace knew she should leave. Every rule said she should turn around and walk out, but then the smallest cub looked up at her. Its eyes were amber, bright and wet, and it made a sound, a small, sad sound, like a cry. Grace put down her box. She walked slowly across the room. She knelt beside the 3 small cubs and reached out her hand. The smallest one pressed its head against her palm. And something changed. For Grace. For the cubs. For everyone. She did not know it yet, but she had just started something that no one could stop. Grace went back the next day. She told herself it was just to check on them, just to see if they were still alive. But she brought extra nutrient packs hidden in her jacket, and she brought a soft cloth to clean their scales. The 3 cubs were waiting for her. They had not moved from the corner. The other cubs in the den ignored them completely, as if they did not exist. Grace had seen this behavior before in Earth animals. The weak ones were pushed out, left to die. She would not let that happen. She knelt beside them and opened the nutrient pack. The cubs did not know what to do at first. They sniffed the food carefully, their small noses twitching. Then the smallest one, the one with the brightest eyes, took a bite. The others followed. Grace watched them eat. Their scales were dull and cracked, a sign of poor health. She took the cloth and began to gently clean them, wiping away the dust and grime. The cubs froze when she first touched them. Then slowly they relaxed. One of them began to make a strange sound, a low, rumbling vibration that Grace could feel in her chest. It was purring. The Kethra cubs were purring. She came back every day after that, sometimes twice a day. She told no one what she was doing. She knew it was against the rules. She knew she could be sent home or worse. But every time she saw those 3 small faces waiting for her, every time she felt their warm bodies press against her legs, she knew she was doing the right thing. After 2 weeks, the change was clear. The 3 cubs that Grace had been caring for were growing stronger. Their scales were shining again. They were eating well, moving well, playing with each other. The other cubs in the same den, the ones no human had touched, were getting worse. Dr. Nathan Cole noticed the difference in his data. He ran the numbers 3 times because he could not believe what he was seeing. 3 cubs in Den 12 were showing improved vital signs. Every other cub in that den was declining. He pulled up the security footage to understand why. He watched Grace enter the den. He watched her feed the cubs, clean them, hold them. He watched them curl up in her lap and fall asleep while she hummed a quiet song. Nathan sat back in his chair and thought for a long time. Then he went to find Grace. She was in the medical bay, organizing supplies. When she saw him coming, her face went pale. She thought she was in trouble. She thought her secret was over. Nathan closed the door behind him. He told her what he had found. He showed her the data. The cubs she had been touching were the only ones getting better. Every other cub on the planet was slowly dying. Grace did not understand. She asked him what she was doing that was so different. Nathan shook his head. He did not know. But he had an idea. He asked her if she had ever heard of studies done on human babies long ago. Studies that showed infants who were not held, not touched, not loved, would die even if they had food and shelter. Their bodies would simply give up. Grace nodded. She had learned about that in school. Nathan said he believed the same thing was happening to the Kethra cubs. They needed touch. They needed warmth. They needed someone to tell them they mattered. And for some reason, the adult Kethra could not give them that. He told Grace he would not report her. Instead, he was going to take this information to Commander Hernandez. The whole mission might need to change. Commander Lisa Hernandez listened to everything Nathan told her. She looked at the data. She watched the footage of Grace with the cubs. She asked questions. Hard questions, and Nathan answered them all honestly. Lisa knew this was dangerous. The Kethra had made their rules very clear. No touching, no contact. If she challenged that, she could destroy the entire alliance between humans and Kethra. She could start a war, but she also knew what the data showed. If nothing changed, every single cub on this planet would be dead within 3 months. Hundreds of lives. The next generation of an entire species. She made her choice. She would speak to the matriarch directly. The meeting happened at sunset, in the matriarch's private chamber. Vorshan sat on a raised platform, her old body wrapped in ceremonial cloths. Lisa stood before her alone and spoke plainly. She told the matriarch what they had discovered. She showed her the data. She explained what Grace had been doing, and she apologized for breaking the rules. But she also said that sometimes rules needed to be broken when lives were at stake. Vorshan was silent for a very long time. Lisa could not read her expression. Kethra faces were not made for human understanding. She waited, her heart beating hard in her chest. When the matriarch finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, tired. She told Lisa a secret the Kethra had kept for 1,000 years. Long ago, before the Great Wars, before the Kethra became the hunters the galaxy feared, they were different. They lived in packs. They raised their young together. Cubs were never alone. They were held constantly, touched constantly, surrounded by warmth from the moment they were born until the day they died. But the wars changed everything. The Kethra needed warriors. They needed hunters who could survive alone, who did not need anyone else. So they changed their traditions. They started leaving cubs alone to make them strong. They stopped holding them. They stopped touching them. And over the generations, something happened. The adult Kethra lost the ability to provide that warmth. Their instincts changed. They could no longer comfort their young, no longer bond with them the way their ancestors had. It was not that they did not want to. It was that they physically could not. The plague had not just killed adults. It had revealed a wound that had been bleeding for centuries. Vorshan looked at Lisa with eyes full of old pain. She asked if humans could really give the cubs what the Kethra could not. Lisa nodded. She said they could, and they would. The matriarch closed her eyes. For a moment, she looked like she was carrying the weight of her entire species on her shoulders. Then she nodded once. She gave her blessing. The humans could touch the cubs. They could hold them. They could try to save them. But she warned Lisa. Not everyone would accept this. There were Kethra who believed the old ways were sacred, who believed that weakness should be allowed to die. They would fight this change with everything they had. Lisa understood. She had faced resistance before. She would face it again. She returned to her ship and called her crew together. She told them what was happening. She asked for volunteers. Every single hand went up. The next morning, the humans entered the dens. They brought nothing but open hands and gentle voices. And the cubs, starving for something they had never known they needed, came to them like water flowing to the sea. The purring could be heard across the entire colony. The first week was strange and wonderful. Humans who had never touched an alien creature before found themselves surrounded by small, warm bodies covered in smooth black scales. The cubs did not care that these beings were different from them. They only knew that the humans were warm. The humans were kind. The humans made the fear go away. Danny Ortiz had never cared much for living things. He fixed engines. He understood machines. Machines did not need comfort. Machines did not have feelings. But on the third night of the program, he was walking past Den 7 when he heard crying. It was not human crying. It was sharper, higher, like breaking glass mixed with thunder. Danny stopped. He looked through the door. A group of cubs were huddled in the center of the room, but one small one was sitting alone near the wall, making that terrible sound. Danny did not think. He walked in, sat down next to the crying cub, and put his big hand on its back. The cub went quiet. It looked up at him with wide, wet eyes. Then it climbed into his lap and pressed its face against his chest. Danny sat there for 3 hours. He did not move. He did not speak. He just held the small creature until it fell asleep. After that, he came every night. He brought his engineering manuals and read them out loud. The cubs did not understand the words, but they seemed to like the sound of his deep, steady voice. By the end of the second week, he had 12 cubs sleeping on him every night. He told everyone it was annoying, but he never stopped coming. Lieutenant Amy Tran had a different approach. She brought her guitar, an old acoustic instrument that had belonged to her grandmother. She sat in Den 4 and played soft, slow songs from Earth, songs about rivers and mountains and home. The cubs gathered around her like she was a fire on a cold night. They pressed close to hear the vibrations of the strings. Some of them tried to touch the guitar with their small paws, curious about where the sound was coming from. Amy let them. She played until her fingers hurt, and then she played some more. The purring of the cubs mixed with the music created something new, something beautiful. Other humans started coming just to listen. They sat in the darkness of the den and felt something they could not name. Peace, maybe, or hope. But not everyone was happy. Kethvor was young for a warrior, only 30 years old. But he had already made a name for himself. He was fast, he was strong. He had killed enemies on 6 different worlds. He believed in the old ways with all his heart. When he saw what the humans were doing, he felt sick. He watched them hold the cubs. He watched them feed them, clean them, sing to them. He saw the cubs purring, pressing against alien bodies, seeking comfort from creatures that were not Kethra. It was wrong. It was shameful. It was an insult to everything his people stood for. He gathered other warriors who felt the same way. There were not many, but they were loyal. They called themselves the True Path, and they believed the weak cubs should be allowed to die. That was nature. That was strength. The humans were creating a generation of soft, dependent creatures who would never survive on their own. They started small. They moved cubs away from the human areas. They blocked doorways. They spread stories about humans having secret plans, about using the cubs for experiments or weapons. Some Kethra believed the stories. Fear was easy to spread. Then Kethvor decided to act directly. He found Grace in Den 12 with her 3 cubs. They had grown so much in the past weeks. Their scales were bright and healthy now. They played and ran and pounced on each other like cubs should. And whenever Grace entered the room, they ran to her immediately, pressing against her legs, purring so loud it shook the walls. Kethvor stepped through the door and blocked her exit. Grace looked up at him. He was massive. His scales were perfect black, his eyes were yellow like poison, and his claws could tear through steel. She knew she should be afraid. Any normal person would be afraid, but she had held these cubs when they were dying. She had felt their small hearts beating against her chest. She had promised them, without words, that she would protect them. She stood up straight and looked into his eyes. Kethvor asked her what right she had. What right did a human, a soft, weak, pathetic human, have to touch Kethra young, to make them dependent, to destroy their future? Grace did not look away. She said that where she came from, they had a saying. The measure of a civilization is not how it treats the strong. It is how it treats the weak, the small, the ones who cannot fight for themselves. She said she thought the Kethra used to understand that, a long time ago, before they forgot. Kethvor did not move. His claws flexed. The three cubs behind Grace made small sounds of fear. They could feel the danger in the air. Grace continued. She asked him why he was really angry. Was it because the cubs were getting help from humans? Or was it because deep inside he knew they were doing what the Kethra could not? Was it shame that made him so angry? Was it fear? Kethavor's eyes widened. No one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever dared. For a long moment, the room was silent. The cubs pressed closer to Grace's legs. She put her hands on their heads, feeling the warmth of their scales under her fingers. Then Kethavor turned and walked away. He did not say another word, but Grace saw something in his eyes as he left, something she did not expect. Doubt. She knew this was not over. Kethavor and his followers would try again. They would push harder. They would do whatever it took to stop what was happening. But Grace also knew something else. The cubs were worth fighting for. All of them. Even the ones who had been taught that love was weakness. She knelt down and let the three small ones climb into her arms. She held them close and whispered that everything would be okay. She did not know if that was true, but she was going to make it true, no matter what it took. That night, Commander Hernandez received a message from the matriarch. Vorshan warned her that trouble was coming. The true path was growing bolder. Some adult Kethra were starting to listen to them. Lisa thanked her for the warning. Then she called her crew together and told them to be ready. They were not soldiers. They were explorers, scientists, engineers, and medics. But they had something that Kethavor and his warriors did not understand. They had something worth protecting. And humans, when they had something to protect, could be stronger than anyone expected. The long night came without warning. That was its nature. The planet's sun moved in strange patterns, and every few months it would dip behind the larger moon and stay there for 3 full days. The darkness was complete. No light reached the surface at all. For the Kethra, this had always been a time of testing. Cubs were placed alone in the wilderness. Those who survived the 3 days of darkness were considered true Kethra. Those who did not were forgotten. It was cruel, but it was tradition. Kethvor saw his opportunity. On the first hour of the long night, he and his warriors moved through the colony. They went to every den where humans had been working. They pulled the cubs away from their caretakers. They ignored the cries and the protests. They took every single cub and placed them in isolation chambers deep in the mountains. It was the old way. It was the right way. The cubs would learn to survive alone, or they would die. That was how the Kethra had always done it. When Commander Hernandez woke up and heard what had happened, she felt her blood run cold. The cubs were not ready for this. After weeks of learning what warmth and comfort felt like, they were suddenly alone in the dark. It would break them. She tried to contact the matriarch, but Vorshan was too weak to respond. The plague had taken more from her than anyone knew. She was dying, and Kethvor had used that moment to act. Lisa called her crew to the main room. Their faces were pale in the emergency lights. Grace was crying. Danny's fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Amy held her guitar like it was a weapon. Lisa told them the truth. She said they had no authority here. This was Kethra territory, Kethra tradition, Kethra law. If they tried to take the cubs back by force, it could mean war. It could mean the end of everything they had built. But she also said something else. She said that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting consequences. She asked them what they wanted to do. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Danny stood up. He said the cubs knew his voice. They knew his smell. They knew he was safe. If he could find them, maybe he could bring them back. Amy stood up too. She said the same thing. The cubs in Den 4 would recognize her music. They would come to her if she played. One by one, every single crew member stood. They were not going to leave the cubs alone in the dark. They could not. Lisa nodded. She told them to be careful, to avoid the warriors if possible, to bring the cubs to the human camp where they could be protected. They went out into the darkness. The colony was black. No lights anywhere. The Kethra did not use artificial light during the long night. It was part of the test. The humans had to use small handheld lights, moving slowly through corridors they barely knew. Grace went to the mountain chambers where her 3 cubs had been taken. She did not know the way, but she followed the sounds. Small cries, scratching, whimpering, the sounds of frightened children who did not understand why they had been abandoned. She found them in a small stone room, pressed together in the corner, shaking. When they saw her light, they made a sound she had never heard before. It was joy and relief and desperation all mixed together. They ran to her so fast they almost knocked her down. She held them. She told them it was okay. She said she was sorry, so sorry, that she had not protected them better. Then she started walking back to the camp. But she was not alone. All across the colony, strange things were happening. Cubs were escaping. Not because humans were rescuing them, but because the cubs themselves were finding ways out. They squeezed through cracks in the walls. They dug under doors. They climbed through ventilation shafts that were supposed to be too small for them. They were looking for something. They were following sounds, smells, memories. They were looking for the humans who had shown them warmth. Danny was halfway back to camp when he heard scratching behind him. He turned and saw 17 pairs of glowing eyes in the darkness. The cubs from Den 7 had found him. They had tracked him across 3 miles of dangerous terrain in complete darkness because they knew his smell. They knew his voice. They knew he was safe. He did not say anything. He just knelt down and opened his arms. They piled onto him, purring so loud it echoed off the stone walls. Amy was playing her guitar at the edge of the camp when the first group arrived. 30 cubs, walking in a line, following the sound of music they recognized. They gathered around her and waited. More came after them, then more. By the second hour of the long night, there were over 200 cubs in the human camp. Kethvor heard about this and was furious. He gathered his warriors and marched toward the human camp. He would take the cubs back by force. He would prove that the old ways were the only ways. When he arrived at the camp entrance, he stopped. The entire crew of the Starward Dawn was standing in a circle around the cubs. They were not armed. They were not fighting. They were just standing there, human hands resting on Kethra scales, human bodies providing warmth in the endless darkness. And the cubs were purring, all of them. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the ground itself. It was like thunder, but warm, like a heartbeat, but bigger than any single heart. Kethvor stared at this sight. He had never seen anything like it. He had never felt anything like it. His warriors looked at him, waiting for orders. But Kethvor did not give any orders. He just stood there, staring. Then slowly he lowered himself to the ground. He sat cross-legged in the dirt, his massive body suddenly looking very small. He looked up at Grace, who was holding her 3 cubs close, and he asked a question. He asked if one of the cubs might come to him. Grace did not hesitate. She whispered something to the smallest of her 3, the one with the brightest eyes, and gently pushed it toward Kethvor. The small cub walked across the space between them. It looked up at the massive warrior with no fear. Then it pressed its head against Kethvor's leg and began to purr. Kethvor closed his eyes. Something changed in his face. Something broke and healed at the same time. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet. He told his warriors to stand down. He told them it was over. The cubs would stay with the humans. The long night continued for 2 more days. But in the human camp, surrounded by gentle hands and soft voices, the cubs slept peacefully. They did not know what had happened. They did not know they had changed history. They only knew they were warm, they were safe, they were loved. And for the first time in 1,000 years, that was enough. 1 year passed. The Kethra colony was not the same place it had been. The old isolation dens were gone, torn down stone by stone. In their place stood new buildings, open and bright, where adults and cubs lived together, where warmth was not weakness, where touch was not forbidden. The plague was cured. Human medical technology had found the answer within 6 months, and no more Kethra died from the sickness that had started everything. But the greater healing, the healing nobody expected, had nothing to do with medicine. The cubs who had been rescued during the long night were growing up. They were strong. They were fast. They could hunt and fight as well as any Kethra in history. But they were also different. They touched each other. They played together. They slept in warm piles, scales pressing against scales, the way their ancestors had done 1,000 years ago. And they remembered the humans, every single one of them. Matriarch Vorshan lived long enough to see the change begin. On her last day, she called Commander Hernandez to her chamber. She was too weak to sit up, but her eyes were clear and calm. She thanked Lisa. Not for the medicine, not for the technology, but for something else. She said the humans had given her people back something they had lost, something they had cut out of themselves in the name of strength. They had given them permission to be whole again. Then she closed her eyes and did not open them again. The new council was formed a month later. Kethvor was part of it. Nobody had expected that, least of all Kethvor himself. But something had changed in him during the long night. The cub that had pressed against his leg, the one with the bright eyes, had followed him everywhere since that moment. It slept beside him. It purred when he was near. It taught him, without words, what love actually meant. He became the strongest voice for change. He spoke to warriors who still believed in the old ways. He told them what he had learned. He said that real strength was not about being alone. Real strength was about protecting those who needed you. Real strength was about being brave enough to care. Not everyone listened. Some warriors left the colony forever, going to distant worlds where they could live by the old traditions. But most stayed. Most wanted to try this new way. Grace was offered a position as permanent ambassador to the Kethra. It was a great honor. She could have spent the rest of her life on this world, helping to build the new society, but she said no. She had a different idea. Working with Dr. Cole and the new Kethra Council, she created something that had never existed before. They called it the Healing Touch Initiative. It was simple. Teams of human volunteers would travel to other worlds, other species, places where evolution had created creatures who could not nurture their young, who could not touch without hurting, who had forgotten what warmth felt like. The galaxy was full of such species. Life took many forms, and not all of them were kind. Some creatures had scales that burned. Some had bodies that gave off poison. Some had simply evolved in ways that made physical contact dangerous or impossible. The humans would help them, one world at a time. The first mission launched 6 months after Grace proposed the idea. She led it herself. Danny came with her, leaving his engines behind for the first time in 20 years. Amy brought her guitar. A dozen other volunteers from the Starward Dawn signed up, and 100 more from other ships across human space. And the 3 cubs came too. They were not cubs anymore. They were young adults now, their scales fully grown, their bodies strong and graceful. By Kethra tradition, they should have left to establish their own territories. They should have gone alone into the darkness, as their ancestors had always done. Instead, they chose to stay with Grace. They did not need her anymore. Not really. They could hunt. They could fight. They could survive anything the universe threw at them. But they did not want to survive alone. They traveled from world to world, meeting species that had never seen humans before. Some were afraid at first. Some were hostile. Some did not understand what the humans were offering. But slowly, carefully, with patience and gentleness, the teams showed them. They touched creatures that had never been touched with kindness. They held young ones that had never known safety. They sang songs and told stories and sat in silence, just being present, just being warm. The cubs, now grown, were often the first to approach new species. They showed them that it was possible, that you could be a predator, strong and fierce and dangerous, and still seek comfort, that you could be capable of killing and still choose gentleness. They became ambassadors in their own right, living proof of what could happen when someone cared enough to reach out. Commander Lisa Hernandez watched all of this from the bridge of the Starward Dawn. She was getting older now. Her hair had more gray in it than she liked. Her bones hurt when the weather changed. But she had never been more proud of anything in her life. She wrote in her captain's log, the final entry before she retired. She wrote that for centuries. Humanity had wondered what they could offer the universe. They were not the strongest species, not the smartest, not the oldest or the most advanced. They had no special powers, no unique technology, no ancient wisdom that other species lacked. But they had something else, something that turned out to be rarer and more precious than anyone had imagined. They knew how to hold something small and frightened and tell it, without words, that it was not alone. They knew how to be gentle in a universe that was often cruel, how to be patient in a cosmos that rewarded speed, how to be soft in a galaxy that demanded hardness. And they knew, deep in their bones, that caring for others was not weakness. It was the greatest strength of all. Lisa finished writing and looked out the window at the stars. Somewhere out there, Grace and her team were arriving at a new world. Somewhere out there, creatures who had never known kindness were about to receive it for the first time. The universe was vast and cold and dark, but it was a little warmer now, a little brighter, because the humans had arrived, and they brought something with them that changed everything. They brought the simple, radical, revolutionary idea that every creature, no matter how strange or frightening or different, deserved to be held. The three Kethra who traveled with Grace understood this better than anyone. Every night they curled around her sleeping quarters, their massive bodies surrounding her small one. They did not need to do this. They chose to. And in the darkness of space, surrounded by warmth, they purred together. It was the sound of something broken becoming whole. It was the sound of love, and it echoed across the stars.